Following on from Homer's works composed during the early Archaic Age, we begin moving towards social complexity. Now, for the next few episodes, I'm going to be focusing on the Archaic Age proper, more generally, and tracing the development of the Greek Polis. Roughly speaking, we are dealing with the time period from around 700 BCE up to the end of the Archaic Period, which is generally considered to be around 480 BCE. And it's marked by the invasion and destruction of Athens by the Persians. While this is the historical periodization, basing the progression of this archaeologically is not ideal, and we'll come to see why that is, especially as socially and economically we see much longer lasting trends and overlaps between all the periods. The majority of evidence during this period, including the cultural dynamics of the polis, the primary urban socio-economic model in urban Greece, comes from Athens, actually. While not ideal to only focus on one city, evidence for polis states from other places like Corinth or Sparta during this early period is not well preserved. We do, however, have a decent amount of evidence from Crete for archaic organisation, mostly as a byproduct of the extensive work there while studying the Bronze Age. I left off last time talking about the drastic changes that we see exemplified from the 8th century onwards. Numerous demographic changes occurred, and we can not only see this in the form of new settlements rising up all over the Aegean, but also by existing ones getting considerably bigger and more stratified. The small villages or hamlets that we saw during the early Iron Age are beginning to amalgamate and come together under the influence of Pan-Hellenism, forming the early phases of what will continually and eventually become places like Athens and Sparta. As a natural consequence of this, we can infer that beginning in the 8th century, there was probably a noticeable population boom, indicating wide economic growth, meaning that societies had to adapt to newer forms of social organisation in order to govern properly. Culturally and artistically, we see drastic changes to coincide with this, such as new art styles depicting the human form as central, as well as the introduction of the new Greek script from the Phoenicians. Unlike Mycenaean Linear B, some of the earliest inscriptions in Greek script are ideological or legal, usually centered around themes of identity, such as who the carver is, their background, or how things should be done. The famous Nestor's Cup that I mentioned in the previous episode is a good example of this. It's a Homeric reference, and potentially used in an early form of symposium, probably among male elites, signalling the importance of Homer in defining the Greek identity. Despite this, from a material culture perspective, the early Archaic period is much more heavily defined by its sense of regionalism. Despite popular thought about ancient Greece as a unified or homogenic culture, it's never really been true that there is simply one single history of Greek culture. While the Greek Empire was briefly unified under Alexander during the Hellenistic period, for the majority of its history, Greece was a loose but interconnected amalgamation of city-states, all of which had their own culture and history and ethnic identity. During the Archaic period, we have a much clearer understanding of how different these regional trajectories are. Primarily through serialization of pottery types, we can differentiate a few distinct cultures at play in the Archaic Aegean. Most prominently, the Proto-Attic, typical of the area around Athens, Proto-Corinthian, around Corinth, and outlying regions and the Eastern Aegean around Ionia. Each of these cultures had their own art style, iconography, and motifs. Eastern Aegean culture, for example, appears to have been made use of wild goats in their iconography quite extensively. While there are certainly some overlaps in these cultures, many of them are equally exerting local differences. All regions use similar religious architecture in the form of sanctuaries, for example, but exactly how a sanctuary shows up in any given place will always be different. One of the driving forces for this regionalism has been argued to be the Orientalizing influence that really defines the Archaic period in general. In the early Archaic, from around 720 to 600 BCE, we see a noticeable Oriental influence being exerted on the Aegean, primarily in art and iconography coming from the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. This is of course nothing new, as intercultural connections between all of these regions were prominent during the Late Bronze Age. The archaic Pythos sherd depicting the birth of Athena, for example, clearly takes inspiration from Mesopotamian cylinder seals depicting young warrior goddesses, such as the Akkadian Ishtar and Ugaritic Anat. In the realm of Greek sculpture, the famous Kudos designs depicting the freestanding male youths clearly derive from Egyptian cultural conventions and proportions. This Eastern influence also penetrates areas of literature, potentially even earlier, with some scholars even noting similarities between Homer's oral tradition and the Akkadian literary tradition centered around Gilgamesh. The influence appears almost ubiquitous throughout the Archaic period, but noticeably declines around the first half of the 5th century, when, as a result of the Persian invasions, the concept of Greekness, as opposed to foreign visitors or enemies, becomes more fully defined, and independent and actively they seem to push away foreign influence. Influences aside, the major development during this period is of course the polis, otherwise known as the Greek city-state. The path to and eventual culmination of Athenian statehood and democracy was likely begun during the 8th century, where we see clear evidence for the nucleation of settlements and villages. Now, I will say this is a challenging period to work with. How exactly we define a polis dramatically affects on how we recognise and study one archaeologically. There are many different ways to approach thinking about polis, and for example, we can use textual or ideological definitions like that from Aristotle's Poetics. This is a fundamentally emic approach. It uses the Greeks' own words that they use to define themselves. Aristotle defined the polis as a self-sufficient and autonomous state that was capable of making and enforcing its own laws. It would most usually have a central settlement, known as an asti, as well as a surrounding hinterland and countryside known as a chora, which acted as its territory, both of which would maintain a strong connection with each other. The chora would likely not have been large, but referred usually to the area immediately surrounding the central city that it relied on for subsistence. Aristotle also seems to imply that the ideal polis would have a form of constitutional government, deciding how their laws would work. He traces its evolution from the komai, the villages in earlier periods, loosely organising together to form an ethne, a confederation of ethnic groups. This is considerably different to how we might define a polis archaeologically, however. Since Aristotle is essentially ideological, we need to rely on more physical metrics for understanding how we recognise a city-state in the material record. There is no magic population number that we can point to as a hard boundary. Some self-identified polises are tiny, but they nevertheless still operate as a state. Therefore, we are not so much looking for places or community as markers of statehood, but more social relations and stratification. Based on things like burials and architectural differences, we can infer differences of social class, implying cultural complexity. Following on from the older palatial systems, we also expect to find monumentality present in a polis, usually around that central village, most commonly relating to identity, whether of the city itself or its prominent families. We can also look to the economy to define means of trade and subsistence. Evidence of specialization, for example, can be a clear marker in defining a city-state, coupled with understandings of who organizes what and how the economy operates, or how goods are distributed across territory. We can't really follow Aristotle's definition of polis as being a result of komai coming together and forming an ethne, as occasionally we also find older urban centres being reoccupied and elevated to the status of statehood, sometimes by new inhabitants. Another challenge with defining and recognising a polis is that the Greek urban centres are kind of unique in the ancient world. They don't always share traditional similarities with other well-known urban centres from Egypt or Mesopotamia, so we really need to be defining a Greek city on its own terms. In comparison with Mesoamerican or Mesopotamian cities, for example, that often had 4-tier hierarchy systems, the Greek polis often had a maximum of 3 classes, but most usually 2, those living in the central city and those who lived in the hinterland. It also rarely had expansive territory to draw from like we see in Egyptian urban centres. This makes comparing urbanism across regions very difficult. We can't use a standard model or checklist approach to see whether Greek policies fit a typical urban model. On the other hand, we risk Hellenic exceptionalism here, believing that Greece is unique compared to other regions and cities. It limits the degree to which we can use the things going on in other places to help us understand the process of Greek state formation. In later periods, we also find alternative forms of statehood in the north and west of Greece, such as the ethno-state that arises in Macedonia, and I'll get to that in another episode. Macedonia did eventually become a city-state later on in its history under Philip and Alexander, but for most of its history it was noticeably different from other Greek states. The ethno-state of Macedonia was much looser, socially and spatially, and organised themselves across the landscape rather than their immediate surroundings. They don't appear to have had a rigidly defined hierarchy like other Greek states had, and occasionally oligarchies arose there. They also appear to be defining their identity very different from Hellenes. The Macedonians seem instead to choose to identify as a nation or spatially over and above political or state-based ethnicity. All of this naturally presents a challenge for us as archaeologists. Most of all, how exactly we define and ultimately even find an archaic city. While it might be tempting to believe that older cities are continuously occupied, this is another one of our problems. A lot of potential archaic cities are currently under modern inhabited towns. They've just been continually lived in. Like Troy, many Greek cities were continuously inhabited, meaning that later Hellenistic towns often overtook and built over archaic cities of the period, often destroying the evidence in the process. Given that many of the sites are still inhabited today, ethical and financial issues are often abound in modern Greek archaeology. Issues around publication and the recording of finds are also a problem. It's not all doom and gloom, though. A good example of a well-studied Archaic Period site is Knossos, actually. The modern town of Herakleion is built over the top of old Knossos village, and is currently expanding relatively quickly. The Urban Landscape project that I mentioned previously has carried out extensive work through almost all the time periods of Knossos' habitation. During the Archaic period, Knossos was again a huge town, roughly housing 30 to 40,000 people. While work is still ongoing to excavate and record all of this, encroachments from the modern city, both legally and illegally, are wearing away at the evidence. All of the work is still currently going on, but naturally it can't be done at places like Athens because of the dense population that still lives there. So it's always a bit of a problem, but it's interesting nevertheless. So, as usual, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week for another episode.